All right, well, we just got to get cracking. We have a little bit of leftovers to do and then done with economics, but we didn't finish the empirical data. And we have a timeline here, much busier board, but I thought I'd put it all on there ahead of time. That way you can actually see, make sure the marking was dark. The only part that we're not going to talk about now, but it's just a review of what we already looked at, and I will point, I know it's a busy board, is this right here. We talked about the New Deal, unemployment during that decade. When all the Keynesian policies were implemented, you went from 6.4% unemployment to 17.2. So the economy was growing out of the Great Depression, and then Roosevelt introduced the measures that are Keynesian, and that's what exacerbated it and caused it. So I just have that on there just by way of reminder. Before I talk about the record of supply side economics in the 20s, 60s, and 80s and beyond, I want to review that concept of the Laffer curve, something I didn't have a chance to talk about, at least in these terms. I introduced it quickly and dropped a marker. And my friend Paul was here, and I don't think he would mind me telling this story because it's a great story, and a lot of people have had an experience like this in college where an aha moment for the professor, but it's a bad kind of aha for him, and not necessarily trying to show him up, but he basically told the story that this economics professor had an auditorium full of 18-year-olds who just didn't know anything, and he could just take advantage of them, as so often happens, and he proceeds to make fun of the idea of the Laffer curve. Hey, anybody here ever heard of the Laffer curve? And a couple of hands went up, but most didn't. And he said, well, anybody who believes in that should be laughed at, and so on. And he proceeded to make fun of it. So finally, my friend Paul stood up, and when he was in college, and he said, hey, I just have a question about that whole Laffer curve thing. Suppose, so you're saying then that 0%, and here's your taxes, here's your revenues going up this way. So you're saying that, correct me if I'm wrong, 0% tax rate, you'd get zero revenue. Is that right so far? Yeah. And so to increase it, now would you say that at 100%, if you taxed everything at 100%, would you get 100% revenue? And immediately, the professor, I wasn't there, but I'm told he was awfully red because he realized he had been caught. Just a bit of common sense that nobody else bothered to ask. And so, of course, he did gymnastics. Well, at some point. He said, well, that's all the Laffer curve is saying. It's saying that at some point you'd get that law of diminishing returns to kick in. It's not saying that at 30% in every economy at all times. That's a straw man. That's not what it's saying. It's saying that at some point you arrive at that point, a marginal rate where you have disincentivized productivity and where the pie will go smaller in the next fiscal year, etc. So that is just an explanation of why supply-side economics is not a theory. It's the way the world works. If you're not understanding that, you're probably hearing some caricature that can easily be, explained by someone who knows what they're talking about, which you may have to, go out there and find. But anyway, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the rest of the empirical data in the 20s, 60s, and 80s. First, we did talk about GDP growth rates a little bit and why they were so erratic prior to the Eisenhower administration, for sure. Not uncommon to have double-digit annual recoveries prior to that time. So a lot's changed in that, and of course Keynesians will take credit for everything, for the market being stabilized and so forth. But as one economist says, our goal should not be to maximize GDP in isolation, but instead to recognize that GDP is only a meaningful measure of well-being to the extent that it represents the desires of the American people. If you care so much about demand, that's a relevant measurement. But anyway, Roosevelt, we already talked about that. Let me fast forward. So, we're looking at the 20s, and all I want to do right now, there's a lot of things we could look at, but I just want to look at the application of that Laffer curve with respect to taxation and revenue, We talked about the fallacy. I promised the numbers. Here they are. At the outset of the I know it's busy, but the pie charts here are only representing before and after, namely before and after the Coolidge tax cuts in the 20s, okay? Prior to that time, before 1920, the top 1% was paying 73% in taxes. The rate was reduced for that top 1% to 25%. Ignore the Laffer curve and say, well, if the economy is $1 billion, let's just say, 73% of that, they're paying $730 million, and now they're only going to pay 20. Just giving you a simplified idea there, but that's actually not what happened, as we've seen. The richest bracket paid 63%. Whereas before, they were only paying 27% at the higher rate. Remember the Kennedy statement. He understood these things. Okay? So why does this happen? Well, for one thing, an underground economy was encouraged to come out of hiding. We talked about the rich don't pay taxes. They pay the richest. They pay lawyers and accountants to avoid all that. Okay, the highest tax bracket as you come out of World War II was 91%. You bring that down, and during the Eisenhower administration, you had a $500 billion increase in GNP. It led to an expansion, healthy expansion, the boom of the 1950s. Okay, between World War II and 1980, inflation ate away at the purchasing price of the dollar. So all that growth was eaten up by that, especially for the poorest. Several growth numbers were inflated with it, some of which we've talked about already. Read Gilder in terms of how some of those statistics are misleading. For example, in the 1970s, there was GDP growth in the 1970s. How'd that even happen? There was a stagflation. How was there growth? Well, one of the reasons was because the divorce rates went nuts, and you all of a sudden had twice as many people working. Women were entering the workforce then. They were paying for daycare, fast food, alcoholism went up. So the numbers were misleading in that sense. Okay, the 60s, over here, you had the JFK tax cut. He didn't implement it because the assassination happened before he could. LBJ instituted it and would not have if it was just up to him because he was a Keynesian. But because of sympathy, because of the assassination, that was popularized, okay? And so it was a 3-year phase-in. It was not as much, and therefore the growth rate was not as much as you would see in the 80s or in the 20s. Nevertheless, it reduced unemployment from 5.2% in 1964 down to 4.5% in 65, and then down to 3.8% in 1966. And the deficit was reduced as well, just as Kennedy predicted. If they had not introduced all the poverty programs, the people would have been brought out of poverty. Instead, they were enslaved in poverty by programs that were designed precisely to do that. Well, then we fast forward to the 80s, and that's the bulk of what I want to show. And there's a lot of stuff over here, and I'm showing this, the 80s, and then I'm bringing around the deficit and the debt. And all this represents, before I forget to get to it, let me get to it now. I told you about the credit card parable. And if I give my credit card to you, the lunch counter at high school, and lunch costs $5 a day, and I say, got a $25 credit limit, I'll let you do that. Give me my card back at the end of the week. You come back on Friday and say, here's your card back. Oh, I needed twice as much. And by the way, you owe me, I said $50 the other day, I slipped, $25. Obviously, if you're spending only $5 over times 5, now you owe me $25. Of course, if you were to tell me that, I would say, I am never letting you borrow my credit card again. And apparently, you don't understand how anything works. Well, guess what? That's exactly what happened after the 1980s, as we were told that the tax cuts created all these wild deficits and so on and so forth. No. But let me give you the worst of the numbers first. The debt was already at $908 billion. Now, these are in trillions over here, because eventually when you get to 82, it starts to hop over $1 trillion. Over here is in billions. That's the deficit. Here's your deficit, here's your debt. Your deficit is how much you went to the lunch counter each day and spent over. Your debt is the total accumulated of that deficit. With me so far? Okay. So, no, the Reagan tax cuts did not cause massive deficits. In fact, they decreased them. 3 times they were reduced during that time. They went up wildly in 82 because it was a major recession, but the Economic Tax Recovery Act was also, like Kennedy's, was also a 3-year phase-in. And so it exploded out of that with growth and reduced the deficit. Yes, the debt doubled because it was already up at that amount. And then you also had, as we're going to see, spending increases that were not curbed, okay? So we have to have a total picture here and not, just allow ourselves to be propagandized, okay? So the 80s, let's talk about a couple of indicators because, of course, everything was a decade of greed. Everything was horrible. Reagan destroyed the earth like Godzilla just coming through and just burning inner cities. And that's what you hear, and that's what we heard in the 90s as they tried to erase people's memory of how much obviously better everything was in the 80s from the 70s. It was fascinating watching my parents' generation just eat it up hook, line, and sinker with such short memories. But at any rate, a couple things happened as a result of Reaganomics, if you want to call it that. Okay? So first of all, in spite of being mocked throughout the 1980 campaign for thinking the free market would end the oil crisis, and I was looking at a couple of op-ed pieces from the 1980 from Wall Street, not Wall Street Journal so much, but Washington Post, New York Times, whatever, just mocking him for that. And he doesn't understand that the experts have told us that the population's going to explode, and like Thomas Malthus, and there's oil shortage as far as the eye can see, and we'll have to only use our lights, and we're going to be in candles, and only 1.5 kids in the next 8 years. And they'd like to forget that that's what they predicted, but they did. Well, when Reagan took office, by immediate executive order, the first weeks of 1981, he ended price controls, and the price of unleaded gas went from $1.41 to 86 cents per gallon. Immediately. Secondly, it is true that the 1982 recession was among the worst since the Great Depression. However, the Economic Recovery and Tax Act, ERTA, was phased in over 3 years from 1982 through 1984. The top right here, remember the pie charts kind of look like Trivial Pursuit pieces. That's what I did over there. I'm going to do the same thing over there, trying to keep it with the same colors, sort of simplify. Here's a before and after picture again. Here's your tax cut in a 3-year phase-in, 82 through 84. The top rate in 1981 was 70%. Now the other tax rate was 50%. So average Americans were still paying half of their taxes. So it wasn't like Carter was a friend to everybody else, So, but at any rate, the top tax rate went from 70% to 28%. Now the other one went from 50 to 15. But it went from 70 to 28%. So again, if you don't understand the Laffer curve, you think to yourself, oh my goodness, now the rich are not going to be paying anything, and poor people are going to be in trouble, and et cetera, and how are we going to pay for these tax cuts? And all those mindless things you hear that have no connection to reality. But intuitively, you can see why it makes sense, okay? But once those first few months went by, what did we see? We saw the longest peacetime expansion in the American economy from 1983 to 1990. You had 21 million new jobs. And these were not post-hole diggers and public sector things like in the other economies that brag about that. Unemployment dropped from 10.5% in 1982 to 5.5% by the end of 1988. And as I said, the tax rate on average Americans, that blue color, went from 50% to 15%. So everybody else who was paying 50 is now paying 15. Okay, so these were not tax cuts for the rich. Oh, were the rich, did they have their tax cut as a percentage dramatically more decreased? Yes, as a percentage. If you started 100%, yes, they did. But that was good for everyone. And again, the whole trickle-down economics thing, it shows a colossal misunderstanding of what's going on. As if So when they hear that, they hear through Keynesian lenses. So I referenced this, and then I didn't quote it, but the 1996 vice presidential debate between Jack Kemp and Al Gore, Kemp had been using this phrase, and I guess the DNC had studied that and prepared Al Gore for this stupid rhetorical response. And Kemp basically said, "You call it trickle down, I call it Niagara Falls," and Al Gore basically said, "The problem with Bob Dole's version of Niagara Falls is that he would put the American economy in a barrel and put it over Niagara," and everybody laughed and missed the point. When a Keynesian hears trickle-down economics, what they have in their mind is that what Reagan was saying is that the rich will be doing so much more that from their yachts, all the crumbs, all the trickle will go down, and there'll be enough spending of the rich and spending of the middle class, and then all the poor people will have enough of those crumbs where they can spend too. Spend. So what are they hearing? They're hearing supply-side economics as Keynesian economics, except as crumbs falling off the rich person's table. You totally misunderstand literally everything. Okay, that's not the point. The point is through investment, not through spending, not even through passbook savings, but through investment, a reduction of capital gains tax and stuff like that. The supply side will grow. Okay, so the whole water, where the yachts and the boats, as it's often said, a rising tide lifts all boats. But metaphors and analogies have their limitations. You can't stop there and just laugh at some cheap rhetoric and not think about what's actually being said. But at any rate, the tax code was also simplified as a result of all that. Now, thirdly, what about that whole deficit debt mythology? Well, you see that board of the totals, but because of this same phenomenon, this before and after thing, the deficit fell from 5.2% of GDP in 1986 to 2.8% in 1989. And as I said, in 84, 87, and 89, the deficit was reduced each year. What happened in those years? The biggest growth rate. Had nothing to do with government spending. It's not government collecting more will reduce this deficit, or maybe they just won't spend as much. You really think the Democrats are not going to spend as much? No, they spent more every year, so it couldn't have been that. No, it was the growth each year that started to pay down the deficit. So it's the exact tax rate reductions are not a government expenditure. A tax rate reduction, unlike one of these targeted tax cuts from GW the second, that we're calling tax cuts in the last 20 years, those aren't tax cuts. A tax rate reduction means you give less to the government in the next fiscal year. And that seems pretty simple and straightforward, but it can be confused. So in that, the revenue from tax receipts nearly doubled from $550 billion in 1981 to $991 billion in 1989. Okay? So why did the debt expand as it did during those 8 years? Just remember that credit card parable if you ever get lost. As Michael Reagan later reflected, quote, federal spending more than doubled. So the revenues doubled, federal spending more than doubled. From $590.9 billion in 1980 to $1.25 trillion in 1990. Adjusted for inflation, that is a 33.4% increase. And so Reagan says, this is Michael Reagan now, when spending increases 33% while revenue increases 20%, so the revenue increased as a result of the tax cuts, just like Kennedy said they would, just like Reagan said they would. But when spending outstrips that, it is clearly spending, not tax cuts, that is to blame for deficits. Now, as far as the political history of that, why did that happen? Well, two reasons. One was Reagan's doing, one was the Democratic Congress's doing. The Democrats had control of that Congress the vast majority of that time during the Reagan years. Reagan did also ask for spending increases on military defense. He spent the Soviets into the ground, and it's a good thing he did. That's what really put the last push through the wall that toppled the Soviet Empire. We just outspent them into oblivion by the end of the decade. So it was a gamble, and he got the tax cuts that he wanted at the beginning, but of course in 1986 there was a tax increase, which sort of went against that. Anyway, fourth factor here, what about the poor? This is great for the deficit debt thing and oil prices and so on, but what about the poor? Sure, everybody had their tax rates reduced, but, well, contrary to the Carter years, which is 1976 to 1980, where the poorest fifth, where do I have that? Yeah, down, it's all the way down here if you can see it, but 17%, the poorest fifth had their real family income drop 17%. As opposed to 1983 to 1989, the poorest fifth saw their family income rise by 12%. You see, these economic laws are not about color. The free market is good for everyone. Slavery, bad for everyone. Okay? So that's how this works. What about inflation? Didn't their purchasing power get eaten up too? No, because inflation was cut in half from 12% to 6%. Now, we didn't get a chance to get into this monetary policy. The Austrian Economic School would tell us Reagan can't take the credit for that. Stop right there. Because as Milton Friedman said, and Murray Rothbard and other people, that inflation is always, it's a monetary phenomenon. Okay, fine, but Reagan did have Paul Volcker. That was his doing, not Reagan. True, but he also said stay the course on the interest rates, and he let him do his thing. And so it's not the point here is not to say, Reagan waved a magic wand and I'm for the Reagan magic wand as opposed to like the Clinton magic wand. And no, the whole point is that the president doesn't have a magic wand. Okay? So we're actually just defending the free market here, not a particular administration per se. Okay? All right. Sixth, you say, well, this is the decade of greed. Surely Michael Douglas was right in that movie, and what was his name? Gordon Gekko. Surely everybody was just, yachts and just like throwing poor people off their yachts on the side of the road. Well, individual charitable donations increased from $64.7 billion in 1980 to $102 billion in 1989, a 57.7% increase in the decade of greed. Okay. Seventh, what about the rich paying their fair share? And I left this for last, even though I drew attention to the shapes, but you can obviously see the same numbers at work. The top 1%, the richest, paid 18% of all federal taxes in 1980. Then after the reduction, they paid 36% of the taxes. Yeah, but they had their rate reduced from 70 to 28. Aren't they gonna, there's tax cuts for the rich, tax cuts for the rich. Again, when you cut the taxes of the rich, they pay more in taxes. And I faintly remember hearing you say that your real motive was to help the poor. But again, if I told you that by cutting their rate, you would actually bring in way more revenue, not even close, so way more money to help the poor. And let's assume I thought that was even a good idea, which I don't. I don't think government can do that, nor do I think government does do that when they collect revenue for a lot of reasons. But let's take that off the table. Let's say they did. What if I told you that reducing their rate increases the revenue, you have more to help the poor with? Are you interested? Crickets. Why? Because that's not your motive. Your motive is a combination of envy and enslaving people so as to build a permanent voter class and a slave class, and all the while say that you love those people and the people that are exposing you hate those people. But we're going to do it the other way. We're going to expose you as the hateful person that is purposefully enslaving that group of people. Okay? Now, what happened after the 80s? Well, you had the co-opting of the Reagan Revolution by the globalist GOP that was in bed with the Clintons and Obamas and everyone else. Reagan, as I said, in order to get defense spending, was forced to sign the 1985 TEFRA tax equity. By the way, they have beautiful names for this. Every time they want to raise taxes, Bill Clinton in 1993, tonight I ask for your contribution. Now, contribution, what does he mean by that? We'll talk about the name of this was called the Tax Equity and Fiscal Responsibility Act. What's implied there? what's implied is that before that it was fiscally irresponsible to give people back their own money. That's fiscally irresponsible because people are idiots. What they should call the name of that act, I'm an elitist and you're a complete idiot act, and I know how to spend your money better than you do. That's what they should call it if they want to be honest, but no, they call it the Fiscal Responsibility Act to have a nice way to say that you're an idiot and that they're smarter than you. And yet, their spending goes up and the deficit goes up every time they do it. Isn't that interesting? But that grinded the recovery down, and a third of the cuts were taken back. And so what could have been 4 and 5% growth rates every year and a total smashing of the deficit down to none and an elimination of poverty in terms of at least the employment rate and jobs available. Of course, you can't make people take jobs, but that was all done away with. The wheels came off. Bush won, the traitor. Now, do you remember 1988? Read my lips, no new taxes. Well, that was what he had to say to get elected. As I said, it was Bush himself that coined the phrase voodoo economics. He never believed in it. He never bought it. And so in 1990, he raised taxes. What happened? A lot of fiscal responsibility and growth? Not at all, just the opposite. Bad recession at the end of 1990 and all of 1991. Finally climbed out of it in 92, but too little too late. He lost the confidence of the American people. Big recession. What happened to the deficit? Went up by a lot. I guess tax rates. So in other words, just the opposite of this phenomenon, we see that in 1990. 2 tax increases. Clinton, 1993, another tax increase. Not as much, couldn't get away with as much. He actually put the top tax rate wound up being 39.6, or was it 36.9%? Where do I have that? Yeah, 39.6%. And the economy eventually grew out of that eventually. And so, well, weren't the 90s this big booming time and so forth? Well, yes, the economy did recover, and finally there were spending cuts, and that's part of the reason why. It wasn't just Alan Greenspan's monetary policy now, but also the 104th and 105th Congress. Remember the contract with America and all that stuff. And the wheels came off the bus on them too. A lot of traders in-house. A lot of people became globalists, that still are to this day. And yet, at the same time, in the moment, they at least did reduce the deficit, and by reducing taxes and government spending. And then you fast forward to I have a target here for the Bush targeted tax cuts. Again, these are not tax rate reductions in the same way that Reagan's were. And so you say, well, those didn't work. Well, they didn't work because they're not tax cuts. They're welfare checks for the middle class. I told people at the time, I said, hey, what'd you do with your Bush tax cut? Same thing with the stimulus bill now. What do you do with your stimulus bill? How'd you spend your stimulus bill? You spent it, exactly. Did you open a business? Of course not. It wasn't enough to do that. And by the way, it ends, it's phased out, and so on and so forth. It's because it's not a tax rate. It's not the same thing Reagan did. And it stands to reason. It's not motivated by the same understanding of economics that Reagan and Kennedy and Coolidge had. And so you have the same thing with Trump, the stimulus checks. The only thing that stimulates is continued ignorance about how economics works. That's really all it does. And more debt that somebody else, like your children, will have to pay. Well, from fiscal year, last point, 1980 to fiscal year 2018, federal government spending rose from that $590.9 billion that we talked about all the way up to $4,109 billion, or in other words, 4.1 trillion. Okay, so an average increase of just over 5.2%. Now, I'm going to say something here that's going to be similar to something I say for a couple of other issues that we'll discuss further down the road. What if there were not two warring visions of economics? And so in other words, what if the Reagan Revolution would have continued, knowing what you know? I'm not asking people that just refuse to understand this. That's fine. I'm not talking to them right now. But if you do understand it, or at least are curious, what if this just was uninterrupted, no static? We have this bizarre virtue of, well, if you have the two parties, they balance each other out. The Founding Fathers did want checks and balances. That's not a check and balance. There's no check and balance between murder and not murder. Well, let's do half murder. No, let's cut off his leg. No, that's not what that means. And so it is here. And so I just want to say in economics, what I'm going to say in a couple of other issues, what if during those intervening 38 years, it's been 40 years since 82, so let's go with that number, 40. What if in the last 40 years, that philosophy of free market went unhindered by half socialism, half free market, okay? And you'll keep hearing that on a couple of other issues. Just something to think about. So we'll stop there. That's enough for economics. It's not an economics course. Just enough to whet your appetite. Read some Friedman, read some Sowell, read some Gilder, Hayek, and von Mises. Do that, and we'll start talking about some other issues next time.